Let's talk about one of my favorite subjects, medieval warfare. Except this time, we're going to talk about the magazine from Karwansaray Publishers. A few months ago, I was contacted by the new editor of Medieval Warfare, Peter Konieczny, to talk about this magazine. And I've talked about it a little bit before, but I'm going to give it a proper review this time. So he sent me two editions. This is volumes 6, issues 5 and 6. These are two new publications that are under him as the new editor. And I'm going to talk about the magazine as a whole. I'm going to use these as an example, but I'm just going to kind of give you a review. And I've never done a magazine review before, but I really like talking about these magazines because this is my all-time favorite magazine subscription that I have. It actually lapsed because I moved to a new house, and during that time I wasn't renewing subscriptions to things that were going to get sent to the wrong address. So I didn't get these couple of magazines, and then thankfully Peter sent these to me for the review. And I will also note before I begin the review that really good news for people in America. These have actually started hitting the shelves. I know that at least at like a Barnes & Nobles, I have seen these magazines on the shelf. So if you're looking for them and you don't want to actually necessarily have an immediate subscription without trying it out first, check it out. Also, digital versions of this magazine are available. So if you want it to, on your iPad or on your tablet or on your phone even, or even a PDF, you can go download it, which is really fantastic. And those are usually actually a little bit less expensive. Obviously, the newer editions are pretty much at price, but you can go all the way into their back catalog and get all their previous magazines. And I actually highly recommend that. Once you kind of get started, you'll like going back and reading the back issues. But let's actually talk about this magazine as a whole. Based on the magazine title alone, you can actually tell that Medieval Warfare is pretty restricted in what they'll actually talk about. Obviously, their primary focus is to talk about the history of medieval warfare, battles, certain types of weapons, and key figures that have played an important role in various battles. One of the things that I really, really like about this magazine is that they theme each issue. So in this issue, the theme is the Knights Templar, whereas the very next issue, the theme is the German Peasants' Revolt. What's great about this is it mixes it up because medieval history as a whole, it spans a very large time frame, and if you only talk about a kind of a generic aspect of medieval history, you're going to miss out on some of the more interesting events that happen. And certainly it's very common to talk about one of three things when you're talking about medieval warfare. You're going to talk about the 100 Years' War, you're going to talk about the Wars of the Roses, or you're going to talk about the Crusades. And realistically, you're only really going to talk about maybe the first 3 Crusades, and only the fourth if you're trying to put a nice tidy bow on it. And you miss out on a lot of really interesting history. You miss out on the German Peasants' Revolt. You miss out on a lot of the other cultures and countries that were just as much fighting wars as England and France were, and just as much as what was happening in the Crusades. So certainly you will get the issues that are like, Templars, which is great because I really like Templars and this is a really fantastic issue. But you do get a nice variety, and I think that's very important because you need that variety when you have a magazine. You want to be able to read through it, read something you never really knew about, and get a little bit more information. And I think that that's where this magazine really just comes out on top because they have absolutely fantastic articles. And I'm happy to give examples. If you look at, for example, the Knights Templar issue, there are 8 articles on the Knights Templar. And the first one is actually just a crash course on who the Templars were. This magazine does a really good job of not assuming that you know what the history is going to be. Now, with the Knights Templar, I would say 90% of the people who are at least passingly familiar with the Middle Ages probably know who the Knights Templar are, but they may not know all the history behind it. And certainly if you're completely brand new to a subject that isn't something like the Knights Templar, but maybe is like the German Peasants' Revolt, you kind of need a foundational understanding of what they're going to be talking about with this theme. So you tend to get that first kind of crash course article, but then you'll dive right into some more interesting information about the the theme. That might be something as simple as someone talking about why they're fascinated by the Knights Templar or why they write about it, or they'll talk about this kind of new style of knighthood. Now, specifically, this issue talked a lot about Bernard of Clairvaux and his Templars and what his role was, but then you get some other little interesting things. But what's probably the most interesting article to me in this case was what they titled the Crusader Catastrophe, which actually goes into some details of one of the battles. And this is probably one of my favorite aspects of this magazine, because when they do talk about battles, they actually give you some diagrams and talk about how the battle actually played out. Now, this is actually pretty interesting. Medieval battles are not actually all that complex, generally speaking. You have maybe a couple fronts and maybe a couple of, physical units of soldiers that get moved around the battlefield. Once they meet, once the battle really begins, not a lot always happens, but sometimes you get some more complicated battles, you get complicated flanking maneuvers, and having nice diagrams for that is actually really, really helpful. Now, one of the things that accompanies all these articles is fantastic artwork. You get usually at least one kind of centerfold piece of art with each issue, and it's going to be specific to the time period and the theme that they are talking about, and you get quite a few different pieces of art throughout, and it's contributed by many artists, so that there's not just a single artist for this, but there's a very good consistency in the art. It's very realistic, and they do a very good job of portraying whatever it is they're trying to portray for at the time. So if you're looking at like a battle sequence, it's actually very juxtaposed what you see in actual medieval manuscripts or medieval art about battles, because those tend to actually blend, the actual historical images tend to blend reality with some skewed vision of medieval fantasy in some ways. But what they have done with medieval warfare is they have gotten us art that kind of portrays the weapons, the armor, and what people would have looked like at the time. And I could just stare at the art. There's so much detail that they really pack it full of so much to look at. I'm absolutely in love with the art. I think every single piece of art that they produce would make a fantastic wallpaper for like a computer desktop, because it just looks that good. And while certainly most of the articles are focused on the primary theme, you do have a few that go into other subjects. And these can actually be really interesting. One of the most interesting ones actually comes from the issue 6 about the Germans' revolt. And oh man, I was so happy to see this article, because I think this is something that is not talked a lot about. But it actually talked about a little bit of myth busting here of the idea of a war flail, of the military flail. And these are seen in a lot of different things. You see it in some art, even medieval art had some of this. And you certainly even see pieces in things like museums, but that's exactly the point, is that the military flail, like we think about it, this kind of ball and chain on the end of a little tiny shaft, is not really actually a thing. There are actually no artifacts of those from the Middle Ages. The earliest, I think, one is dated, according to this article, is like the 16th century. And it's just not quite medieval, but there is some semblance of a truth to its existence. It just wasn't medieval European in a lot of ways. You did have other cultures, like Eastern cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, that actually had forms of flails and whatnot. But it was a really interesting article that spoke very specifically to, don't confuse what people think and what we have as this kind of popular culture with historical fact. And it actually talks a bit about that. Like, there is a way that you have to define historical validity with something, and when you're talking about whether or not something just simply existed, it's almost not enough that someone will reference it or that there's a piece of art. I think of like Talhofer's manuscripts, where he has all these different pieces of art about weapons, and I don't think any of his weapons probably actually really existed. They were all just kind of conceptual. Just as much as Leonardo da Vinci's sketches may not mean that he actually built every single one of those things. It's just he sketched it out, and it was an idea that he maybe could have executed. Doesn't mean it ever actually truly existed. And the same thing holds true here. If you don't have the artifact, you can't really say it exists. And I think that's a very interesting insight that you don't get in a lot of magazines. Because generally speaking, people just want to put out the content and say, trust us on this. And this gets me into kind of the last thing I want to talk about with these magazines, and probably, I think, not only the most important, but probably one of my favorite aspects, is that at the end of every article, they have references that you can go and do further reading. And so if they have done a small history or they talked about a certain battle, well, they're probably researching it on many books, and they're pulling in the information and writing this 2 to 4 page article. Well, so now you have 5 or 6 books that they have pulled information from, and they reference it. A good, solid bibliography, and that's really important when you're talking about history. You want to be able to reference the historians who have provided this information to the article writers. And so what's great about it for me is I go and I read an article, and I'm like, okay, yeah, Knights Templar, I like Knights Templar. Oh wait, who's this Bernard guy? I never really knew much about him. Oh, look at all these. Look, there's a book that's about this one individual person and his life. Let me go read that book. And I think that is what this magazine really, really provides. Almost more than anything is it's kind of a gateway into your own kind of personal historical research. As you're more interested in one subject over another, you can actually go and dive deeper into those subjects. Now, I found that reviewing magazines is actually very, very hard to do. It's mostly because, unlike other things I might review, like a single product or a book even, there's not kind of like a single thing to talk about. There's not a single aspect you really want to kind of hone in on. And that a lot of that has to do with this being very much a collaborative effort. Magazines are not a single author. They are the effort of a lot of individuals to bring you very, very good magazines. And so I'm going to kind of speak to some of the highlights of why I think that this is one of the all-time greatest medieval magazines out there to go check out. First and foremost, the publishers, Karwansaray, they do a very good job actually just bringing you a solid publication. What I mean by this is the paper is very thick stock. The print is very nice print. When you hold this in your hands, having it physically in your hands, it's a nice feeling. The pages are nice. The resolution and the quality of the print is so nice that you're not like fuzzy images taken from the internet or anything. All very, very high quality. The editing on this, certainly these two that Peter sent me under his editorship, but even their backlog has always been really well put together. The theming is very good, and the way this is all put together is really nice. Between those two, the editor and the publisher themselves, there's not a lot of wasted space. These are very actually thin magazines. They're only about 50 some odd pages depending on the volume, but there's very little wasted space. You have a few ads like on the back, and you have a few throughout the pages. They're all relevant. They're all very much targeted to people who like the Middle Ages and things such as that. Certainly, they don't take up a ton of space. You only have a few here or there. And if you're an American like me, they're less useful because they're all in euros and they're all for European companies. But if you're in Europe, hey, it's great. You'll be able to look at all these ads and actually want to buy all the stuff that I want to buy, but really probably isn't realistic or feasible for me to do so. Yeah, very, very little wasted space in this magazine. Now, of course, the contributors to the magazine, the article writers, they do a fantastic job. They're very well written articles, very concise, to the point, which is actually very hard to do when you're trying to reduce very complex subjects down to only like a 4-page article. But they do a really, really fantastic job of bringing you the information and getting you the taste of the information, and then giving you a bibliography for you to not only fact check, but go research more, which is just great. And of course, the art, fantastic art, love the art. Great artists all around. There are, of course, a couple other things that are in this magazine. There are books and movie reviews and such. They kind of tail end of the magazine. Those are okay. I, as a reviewer myself, I can appreciate it's very difficult to do reviews, and certainly written word reviews can be very difficult as well. But you know, that's not my primary focus for this magazine, so they're there and I will read them, but not usually my big focus. But cover to cover, I love this magazine. Every issue I get, I can't wait for the next one, and I just kind of drip feed it to myself because I have to make it last, so I read like an article a day until I've read through the entire thing. Now these two, I actually read cover to cover in just a couple days for both of them, so I could do this review and be ready for it rather quickly. But I love this magazine. I cannot recommend it enough. If you're, again, stateside, these are on some magazine shelves. This is a little bit expensive, coming in anywhere between $10 and $12 depending on where you buy it. Obviously, there's the recommended price of about $11 US. It's expensive for a magazine this size, but you are getting straight content. There's very little fluff, very few ads, and you're getting straight to the really, really good stuff. And I I think it's well worth the price. I pay it every single time. And I can't wait to renew my subscription either, because now I'm in my new house, I can renew it. And there are other similar magazines from Karwansaray. They have Ancient Warfare, so if you're more interested in other types of history as well as ancient history, that's a good one to check out. And they have a lot of other publications, so I actually suggest you go check out the publisher themselves. Medieval Warfare, one of my all-time favorite magazine publications. I cannot recommend it more highly. Go check it out. I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out Medieval Review on Patreon.